I'm Grace Monroe, 27 years old, and the night my grandfather was shoved out of my parents' front door into a pounding storm is burned into my memory like a bad photograph. The rain was coming down so hard, it blurred the streetlights and turned the porch steps slick and shining. A few hours earlier, he had handed my father more money than I could imagine trusting his own son to keep him safe in his last years. Instead, I heard my dad's voice echo down the hallway, calling him a burden, like 83 years of life and sacrifice added up to nothing. The door slammed behind me as I ran after my grandfather, his shoulders sagging inside a thin coat that wasn't made for cold wind and sideways rain. I wrapped my arms around him on that porch and promised out loud that he would never be alone as long as I was breathing. What I didn't know that night was that the promise I made in the storm would change everything I believed about family money and what it really means to take care of someone. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments and tap that like and subscribe button if you've ever watched someone choose money over the people who raised them. I grew up in a solidly middle-class neighborhood in Ohio, the kind of place where kids rode bikes until the streetlights flicked on and everybody knew whose dog kept digging under the fences. My parents both worked office jobs, nothing glamorous, but enough to keep a 3-bedroom house, 2 cars, and a steady stream of takeout containers in the fridge when nobody felt like cooking. From the outside, we looked like any other family on our block, but there was always this invisible weight hanging over the dinner table, a sense that we were waiting on something we didn't talk about much. That something was my grandfather, Leonard Whitaker, the man whose name showed up in business magazines and financial news, even though he still wore the same worn denim jackets he'd favored back when he was just a rancher with more grit than cash. Grandpa Leo didn't live with us when I was a kid. He stayed in a modest brick house on the edge of town, the kind with a small porch and a rusted mailbox that made him look like any other retiree on the block. But even as a teenager, I understood there was a big gap between the world I saw and the one he actually occupied. When I got old enough to Google him, I found articles about land deals in Idaho energy investments and a string of quiet partnerships that had turned him somehow into the kind of man people called a billionaire. He never talked about it. When he came over for Sunday lunches, he brought homemade jam and stories about cattle and droughts, not yachts or private planes. My parents, though, couldn't stop glancing at the watch on his wrist, or the car that dropped him off at the curb like they were counting zeros every time he walked through the door. From the time I can remember, my grandfather tried to teach me simple rules. Keep your word, work harder than feels fair, and remember that money is a tool, not a scoreboard. He'd sit with me at the kitchen table, tracing out little grids on a yellow pad, showing me how compound interest worked with pennies and quarters. "This is how you make life easier for the people you love," he'd say, tapping the numbers with his pen. My parents would nod along, but there was a different kind of conversation when he wasn't around. They talked about security and our share, and how after everything they'd put up with it, wouldn't be wrong for him to help them out in a big way. It was never spoken directly, but I heard it anyway. My grandfather's money wasn't his life's work. It was a prize they felt they deserved. By the time I finished college and landed my first job writing software for a small healthcare company, my life looked nothing like the glossy pictures in those articles about my grandfather. I shared a tiny apartment with a roommate, drove an old sedan that whined every time I turned the wheel too hard, and watched every dollar I spent, even when it came to splurging on good coffee. I liked my work and the sense that I was doing something useful building tools that actually helped nurses and patients. But my paycheck barely kept pace with rent loans and the usual little emergencies that seem to pop up just when you think you're getting ahead. The contrast between my quiet, frugal life and my parents' constant daydreams about when your grandfather finally does the right thing felt sharper with every passing year. It wasn't that we were poor. We weren't. My parents had their house, their cars, their weekend dinners out at chain restaurants off the highway. But they talked about sacrifice in a way that made me uncomfortable, like aging parents were a debt waiting to be repaid by a bigger bank account. My dad Thomas worked long hours and reminded us of it every chance he got. My mom Elaine kept mental lists of what we could have had if circumstances had been different. and all of it seemed to circle back to the same place: my grandfather's decision to keep living modestly, to keep control of his own wealth, to avoid tossing out giant checks just to quiet their complaints. I was closer to Grandpa Leo than to either of my parents, and they knew it. I was the one who drove him to doctor's appointments once he stopped trusting his own reflexes behind the wheel. I was the one who sat with him on quiet Tuesday afternoons, listening to stories about the early years on the ranch and the years later when he had to make layoffs he never forgave himself for. He talked about regrets and second chances, about the pressure that comes when you have more than enough while the people around you are struggling to get by. Money doesn't fix people, he told me once, staring out the window at nothing in particular. Sometimes it just gives them more room to show who they already are. At the time, I thought he was talking about old business partners or people from the past. I didn't realize he was looking straight through our living room walls. The first real crack in the surface came on a quiet evening that should have been ordinary. The house smelled like roast chicken and my mother's favorite vanilla candles. The TV was muted in the background, and a soft rain tapped at the windows. My father had invited my grandfather over to talk his tone light, but his eyes a little too bright when he told me about it that morning. Something in the air felt off, like the way the sky looks right before a summer storm, heavy and waiting. When Grandpa arrived, he wasn't in his usual denim jacket. He wore a dark suit that hung a little loose on his shoulders, and he carried a thick envelope that he set on the coffee table with more care than I'd ever seen him use on anything. I took my usual place on the end of the couch while my parents settled in across from him, their faces arranged into polite concern. My dad cleared his throat. My mom folded her hands in her lap, and for a long moment, nobody said a word. Then my grandfather rested both hands on the handle of his cane, looked slowly from my father to my mother, and told them he was ready to make sure he had a place to stay, a roof over his head, and people he trusted to look after him. It was the kind of conversation most families dread, but eventually have the kind that can be tender or tense, depending on how much love is actually in the room. What I didn't understand sitting there watching his fingers tremble near that envelope was just how much was on the line that night, or how quickly the promise of care could twist into something colder than the storm that waited just beyond our front door. The quiet tension from that evening settled into the walls of the house like a draft, and over the next few days I could feel a shift in the way my parents moved through the rooms. They were more alert, more deliberate, as if waiting for something to happen. A few nights after my grandfather placed that envelope on the coffee table, my father called a family meeting. He stood at the head of the dining table with the envelope resting right beside him, its edges still crisp and untouched. My mother sat straight in her chair with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression carefully arranged. I took a seat at the end of the table, watching the way my father kept glancing down at that envelope as if it were a living thing. My grandfather arrived a few minutes later with his cane tapping softly against the hardwood floor. He looked tired but composed, wearing the same dark suit he'd worn the night he made his request. My father gestured for him to sit, and when he did, my father opened the envelope with slow, deliberate movements. There was a long pause as he pulled out a thick stack of documents. He skimmed the pages, his eyes widening slightly, then narrowing. Finally, he placed the stack on the table for all of us to see. On the top page were several signatures, banking details, and one unmistakable number, $50 million. My mother let out a soft breath, almost a gasp, and covered her mouth. My father leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight as he tried to absorb what he was holding. My grandfather clasped his hands together and looked at both of them with a calm gaze. "I want to make sure I have the support I need," he said, his voice steady. "I want to stay with family, and this should provide comfort for all of us." My father nodded slowly, then quickly, as if convincing himself. My mother's voice broke through the silence, bright and warm. "Of course," she said, leaning toward him. "You'll be cared for here. You won't have to worry about anything." I watched the way their eyes lingered on the documents longer than on him. My grandfather offered a small smile, though his eyes seemed distant. He reached for his cane, rose from the chair, and thanked them for hearing him out. My father guided him toward the living room, his tone full of enthusiasm as he spoke about safety and comfort. I followed a few steps behind, sensing the shift in the air, something subtle and sharp. That first week my parents played their roles with precision. My mother set the table early each morning, arranging fresh napkins and placing a mug of hot coffee in front of my grandfather before he even sat down. My father greeted him with a cheerful tone that carried through the kitchen, praising the breakfast my mother prepared and asking about his sleep. I watched from the corner of the room, noticing how each gesture felt practiced, almost rehearsed. My grandfather responded politely, though I often caught him glancing toward the window or at the worn leather of his cane when no one was looking. On the surface, it seemed like everything was going the way he'd hoped. My parents made sure meals were warm and his chair was comfortable, and they walked him through the house as if showing off a place meant just for him. But beneath that comfortable routine, something else was forming, a quiet tension that hung between their words. My father's cheer sounded too bright, and my mother's compliments were always followed by a quick glance toward that envelope on the counter. It was like they were waiting for something to settle into place, something they hadn't quite earned but already claimed as theirs. A few weeks later, I walked past the kitchen late at night and noticed the door slightly open. Light spilled across the hallway, and I heard the sharp edge of my father's voice. I paused, listening. "He's eating like he hasn't had a meal in days," my father said in a low, frustrated tone. "Do you know what groceries cost now? If he keeps this up, that money will be gone before I can even put it to work." My mother's voice followed, hushed but firm. "Keep your voice down," she said. "Just be patient. We'll tighten things a bit at a time. He won't notice." I stood there without moving, the refrigerator hum, cutting through their whispers. My grandfather's room was at the opposite end of the hall, and I wondered if he could hear them through the thin walls. When I carried a cup of tea to him that night, he gave me a small smile. His hands wrapped around the warm mug, and he nodded his thanks, though I could see something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He didn't say a word about what he might have heard, and I didn't ask. As days turned into weeks, the careful routines began to fade. My mother stopped laying out the breakfast table in the morning, leaving cereal boxes on the counter for whoever arrived first. My father's cheerful greetings turned into rushed nods as he grabbed his keys before heading out the door. The small kindnesses that once anchored the mornings were replaced by brief conversations about schedules, grocery lists, and appointments. My grandfather woke up earlier than anyone else, sitting quietly in the living room with his coffee growing cold beside him. One rainy afternoon, I sat with him on the couch while the storm tapped gently at the windows. He was leaning slightly forward, hands resting on his cane, when he asked Grace, "Do you think money changes people?" His voice sounded thoughtful, not bitter. I turned toward him, unsure how to answer. He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I thought this would bring us together," he said softly. "Instead, it feels like I've placed a weight on all of us." Before I could respond, my mother walked in from the kitchen with a smile that seemed a little too bright. She commented on the weather and asked if he needed anything, though she didn't wait for an answer. My grandfather leaned back into the couch, the earlier thought fading behind his polite expression. That moment stayed with me, sitting between us like a quiet reminder of something we couldn't quite name. The turning point came on a night when the wind rattled the windows hard enough to shake the curtains. I had been working on my laptop in the living room, trying to focus on a project while the storm gathered strength outside. The lights flickered twice, and from the kitchen came the sound of a glass breaking. My father's voice followed louder than the thunder. "I've had enough," he shouted. "I can't do this anymore." I put my laptop aside and hurried toward the kitchen. Shards of glass glinted on the tile floor, and my father stood with his fists clenched at his sides. My mother stood near the sink. Her arms crossed her face, unreadable. My grandfather appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on his cane. He looked between them, the storm echoing through the house. "Is this what it has come to?" he asked quietly. "I gave you everything." My father's response cut sharply through the room. "You think that gives you the right to control this house," he said. "You're a burden. You always have been." The storm outside roared louder as he stepped past my mother, reached for the front door, and pulled it open. Cold air and rain rushed inside. "Get out," he said, pointing into the darkness. My grandfather's shoulders wilted, his cane trembling against the floor. My mother didn't say a word. I stood frozen for a moment before rushing toward him, calling his name. My father's voice followed me down the hallway. "Grace, stay out of this." But I didn't stop. I stepped into the rain, wrapping my arm around my grandfather as the downpour drenched us both. His coat clung to his frail frame, and he leaned into me without a word. The door shut behind us with a heavy thud, sealing the moment in a way nothing could undo. I guided him down the steps, the storm swirling around us. We walked into the night together, the wind pushing against us as we made our way toward my car. My grandfather didn't speak, and neither did I. The storm had taken more than warmth from the house behind us. It had stripped away the last illusion of safety. By the time we reached the car, I couldn't hear anything but the rain and the sound of my own breath. I opened the passenger door, helped him inside, and turned back toward the house once. The windows glowed softly through the rain, but they revealed nothing. As I started the car and pulled away from the curb, I knew the night was only the beginning of what was waiting for us. By the time I pulled into the narrow lot beside my apartment building, the storm showed no sign of letting up. Wind pushed against the car doors when I opened them, and rain swept sideways across the pavement. I helped my grandfather step out, steadying him as he leaned on his cane and held his coat closed with his free hand. The building's hallway lights flickered in the same uncertain way they always did, and I guided him inside slowly, taking each step as if we had all the time in the world. When we reached my apartment, I unlocked the door and led him into the small, cluttered space that barely fit me most days. He looked around without a hint of complaint, just a tired nod as he settled into the only chair I owned that didn't wobble. I turned on the small space heater near the wall and set a clean towel on his lap so he could dry his hands. Steam from the kettle drifted into the air as I cooked instant noodles on the stove. The apartment felt quiet in a way I hadn't noticed before, with the storm muffled by the worn windows. When I placed the bowl in front of him, he lifted it carefully, warming his hands on the sides. He ate slowly, stopping now and then to catch his breath, and I sat across from him on the edge of the bed, waiting until he finished. After the dishes were rinsed and set aside, I made up the bed with an extra blanket and encouraged him to rest. The days that followed moved gently, marked by small routines. I brewed his coffee in the morning and watched him take careful sips as he sat near the window, studying the street below like it was unfamiliar territory. In the evenings, we shared simple meals and talked about his early years on the ranch, stories about broken fences and long summers that stretched across open land. When he spoke, there was a steady rhythm in his voice, and I found myself listening without interruption, letting his words fill the quiet space between us. He asked me about my work, my plans, and what I hoped to build in the future. I told him a little at a time, surprised by how easy it was to talk when the apartment felt calm and sheltered. Despite the ease of those early days, I could see small changes in him. His steps grew slower, and he paused more often when standing. He tried to hide the moments when he needed to catch his breath, brushing off my concern with a wave of his hand. When I returned home late from a shift at the cafe or a delivery run, he would be sitting on the bed with the lamp on, watching the streetlight flicker outside the window. He always asked if I had eaten, even when he hadn't finished his own plate. I could tell he didn't want to trouble me, and I didn't push him, though. The worry lingered long after he went to sleep. I picked up a second job to keep up with rent and groceries, splitting my days between early mornings at the cafe and late nights delivering takeout around town. When I came home between shifts, I heated soup or leftovers, and he would sit close by as I stirred the pot. Sometimes I heard him moving around the apartment while I was gone, tapping his cane lightly against the floor as he checked the windows or straightened the few items we had. I noticed the effort he put into staying busy, even though his energy was fading. One evening while I sliced vegetables, I heard him speaking softly near the window. I paused, listening. The words were faint, almost lost beneath the sound of passing cars. "I don't want to be a burden," he said. I stepped toward him, and he looked up, startled that I'd heard. His expression had the same quiet dignity I'd seen so many times over the years, but now it was mixed with something more fragile. I told him that he wasn't a burden, choosing my words carefully. He nodded and rested his hand on the arm of the chair, but his gaze drifted toward the floor. Later that night, when he lay curled under the blanket on the bed, his breathing sounded heavier than usual, each inhale slow and deliberate. I lay on the thin mattress beside the bed, listening for any sign that he was awake or uncomfortable. The apartment felt smaller than wrapped in silence, except for the hum of the heater and the low whistle of wind through the window frame. As the weeks passed, his cough grew more persistent. At first, he dismissed it as a lingering cold, brushing aside my concern with a tired smile. But soon the cough deepened, shaking through him, with enough force to leave him gripping the arm of the chair. I brought him warm water, then tea with honey, but the relief never lasted long. During one shift at the cafe, I found myself watching the clock more than the espresso machine, worrying that he might fall or struggle to breathe before I got back. When I came home that evening, he was sitting near the window with his coat draped over his shoulders, staring outside at nothing in particular. He turned as I walked in and gave me a small smile, but his eyes looked tired in a way that made the room feel colder. The night I decided to take him to the hospital began with another round of coughing that didn't stop. He tried to wave me off, insisting it would pass, but his breath caught in his throat and the sound of it made my decision for me. I grabbed my keys, helped him into his coat, and guided him into the hallway. The drive was quiet, and the lights of passing cars blurred through the windshield. When we arrived, the bright hallway felt harsh compared to the dim light of the apartment. Nurses moved quickly around us, guiding him into a room and beginning their work, while I stood by the door holding his coat and cane. I sat in a chair beside his bed after the nurses left, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest as machines hummed nearby. He reached out and touched my hand, giving it a small squeeze. I could see the effort it took for him to smile, and I tried to match it with one of my own. The hours passed slowly, marked by the soft sounds of monitors and the occasional footsteps in the hallway. When he drifted to sleep, I rested my head against the wall, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor and hoping it wouldn't change. My parents arrived later that night, their footsteps audible long before they entered the room. My mother carried a bouquet of grocery store flowers wrapped in thin plastic. My father stood near the foot of the bed, tapping his fingers against his phone before stepping out into the hallway to answer a call. My mother placed the flowers on the small table near the window and took a seat in the corner. She didn't say much, and my father didn't stay long. When they left, the room felt still again, and I moved my chair closer to my grandfather's bedside. He opened his eyes a little while later and whispered, "You're here." His voice was faint but steady. I nodded and helped him take a sip of water before settling back into the chair. He looked at me with a tired expression and said, "You've given me more than you know." His hand rested on mine for a moment, warm and familiar. I didn't say anything, letting the quiet fill the space between us. The storm had passed outside, but the weight of everything we were facing lingered in the room. When morning light crept through the blinds, I stepped out to the hallway to stretch my legs. A nurse stopped me near the desk, asking a few questions about his medications and daily habits at home. I answered each one carefully, watching her take notes before she nodded and thanked me. As I walked back toward his room, I could see him resting again, his breathing slow and controlled. I stood there for a moment, taking in the small movements of his chest as the monitor continued its steady rhythm. I pulled the chair closer and sat beside him, ready to help however I could. But even in that quiet moment with morning light softening the edges of the room, I felt the sense that something larger was approaching, something I couldn't avoid or delay. The pages of his life were turning more quickly now each day, bringing us closer to a moment I wasn't ready to face. The following morning slipped by in a blur of medical rounds, soft voices at the nurse's station, and the low hum of machines running their quiet rhythm. I stayed at my grandfather's bedside, watching the light move across the floor as the sun rose and settled into the long day ahead. His breathing was slow and measured, each inhale a little shorter than the one before. I walked to the window once or twice, taking in the view of the parking lot and the bare trees bending in the winter wind, but my attention never drifted far from him. At midday, a nurse brought in a tray with warm broth, and I helped him sit up to take a few spoonfuls. He murmured thanks without opening his eyes for long. Later that afternoon, my parents returned. My father stood near the doorway, glancing around the room as if unsure where to settle. My mother sat in the same chair she had used the night before, crossing her legs and smoothing her skirt before offering a polite nod in my direction. Neither of them said much, and the silence inside that hospital room stretched for several minutes. When my grandfather stirred, my mother leaned forward to adjust his blanket, though she didn't speak to him directly. My father checked his watch every few minutes until finally announcing they had things to handle and would be back later. After they left, the room felt calmer again, and my grandfather rested more easily. As evening approached, I stepped out to the hallway for a moment to stretch. The nurse who had cared for him that morning approached with a small notepad in her hand. She asked about his medications, his appetite at home, and whether he had any recent falls. I answered each question carefully, thinking back over the past few weeks. She nodded with understanding and mentioned that the doctor would be by soon. When I returned to the room, I found my grandfather awake, his eyes following the faint movement of cars passing below the window. He turned his head slightly when I came in and offered a tired smile. "Sit with me," he said softly. I pulled the chair closer to the bed and settled beside him. For a while, neither of us spoke. He rested his hand on the blanket. His fingers relaxed, but thin and pale beneath the hospital lights. When he finally spoke again, his voice was steady. "You've been here every minute." I nodded, unsure how to respond. He looked away for a moment, studying the corner of the room as if gathering his thoughts. "I worry," he said. "Not about me, but about what this has meant for you." I told him not to think about that, but he continued. "You've taken on more than I ever meant you to. I thought moving into your parents' home would be easier for everyone. I thought it would give us more time." His voice trailed off for a moment, and I could see the effort it took for him to continue. "But the money changed things. I didn't expect it to go the way it did." He paused to take a slow breath. I watched his chest rise and fall, careful and controlled. "When you brought me to your apartment," he said, "you gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time. You gave me peace." His words settled into the space between us, carrying a quiet weight that I didn't try to interrupt. The room felt still, as if everything outside had paused long enough for him to gather the rest of what he wanted to say. A doctor entered the room a few minutes later, breaking the moment gently. He introduced himself as Dr. Hensley, a tall man with reassuring eyes and a calm tone. He asked my grandfather a few questions, checked his breathing, and listened to his chest. After a brief conversation with both of us, he explained that my grandfather's condition required monitoring and that they would likely keep him for at least a few days. My grandfather nodded without protest. When the doctor left the room, grew quiet again, except for the soft rhythm of the machines. That night, my parents returned once more. My father walked in briskly, asked how things were going, and stood near the foot of the bed. My mother placed another bouquet on the table, this one slightly larger than the last. She commented on the lighting in the room and asked if he needed anything, though she didn't wait for an answer before turning toward the window. My father stepped out into the hallway to take a call, leaving me with my grandfather and the quiet hum of hospital life around us. When visiting hours ended, the nurse offered to bring in a blanket and pillow in case I chose to stay. I accepted both and moved my chair a little closer to his bedside. My grandfather drifted in and out of sleep, his breathing slow but steady. I sat there in the dim light, listening to the quiet beeps of the monitors, while the hallway activity faded into the background. Every now and then he opened his eyes long enough to see I was still there, and then he rested again. As the hours passed, a soft rain began outside, tapping against the window in a steady rhythm. The sound was familiar, almost soothing. I remembered the storm we had walked through when we left my parents' house, how the wind had pushed against us, and how heavy his steps had been that night. Now the rain sounded gentler, more subdued. I let the sound fill the silence while I shifted in my chair, adjusting the blanket around my shoulders. Near midnight, my grandfather stirred again. He looked toward me with a calm expression, though his eyes were a little unfocused. "Grace," he whispered, "you have a good heart." I reached for his hand, and he tightened his grip slightly. "I want you to remember something," he said. "The things we build in this life, they matter more than what we own." His voice faded after that, but the message lingered. I sat with those words for a long time, letting them settle in the quiet room. The next morning arrived with the soft glow of sunlight creeping through the blinds. I stepped into the hallway to stretch my legs and wash my face, then returned to find him resting peacefully. His breathing was slower than the night before, steady but shallow. A nurse entered to check his vitals and adjust the blankets, giving me a reassuring look before leaving us alone again. I pulled my chair closer to the bed and took his hand gently in mine. The room felt calm with the muted sound of footsteps in the hallway and the soft beeping of the machines giving the space a steady rhythm. I sat with him recalling the long walk we had taken through the storm weeks earlier, how I had held him close to keep him steady. Now the world outside was quiet with sunlight warming the window pane instead of rain. As the day went on, I stayed near him, watching the rise and fall of his chest and listening to the sounds of the hospital moving around us. I didn't know what the next hours would bring, but I could sense we were nearing a moment I had tried not to think about. The weight of everything that had led us here, the storm, the apartment, the long nights, seemed to gather in the quiet space of that room. And as I held his hand, I realized that whatever was coming next would shift the path ahead of us in a way I couldn't yet see. The following days after my grandfather passed moved in slow motion. I handled the hospital paperwork, signed documents I could barely read, and waded through quiet hallways that smelled faintly of antiseptic and early morning coffee. I made sure his things were gathered into a small plastic bag, his watch, his wallet, the worn handkerchief he kept folded in his coat. The funeral home called later that afternoon, and I answered with a calm voice, even though my hands trembled each time I spoke his name. When we met with the director, my parents sat across the table exchanging clipped suggestions about arrangements and schedules, their tones neutral and efficient. I nodded along when needed, keeping my attention on every detail that honored the life he lived. The memorial service was small, just family and a few neighbors who remembered him from the years he spent in town. I stood beside the front row as people offered condolences and shared quiet stories about the man who used to fix fences for them without asking for anything in return. My parents greeted each guest with polite smiles, speaking about my grandfather's long life as if the last months had unfolded differently than they had. After the final prayer, the room emptied slowly, and I walked outside to clear my head. The winter sun cast a pale light on the sidewalk, and for a moment the world felt still. A few days later, an envelope arrived at my apartment. It held a formal letter from the law firm of Thompson and Gray, requesting my presence at the reading of my grandfather's will. My parents received their invitations as well, along with my cousins Mark and Jenna. The meeting was set for the following week. I folded the letter neatly and placed it on the counter, knowing the day would bring questions I wasn't ready to face. Still, I marked the date on my calendar and prepared myself for whatever the lawyer might reveal. On the morning of the appointment, I dressed in the same black dress I had worn to the service. The fabric still held the faint scent of the flowers that had surrounded his casket. When I arrived at the law office, the receptionist guided me to a conference room with dark oak shelves and tall windows overlooking the street. My father was already pacing near the far wall, his hands shoved into his pockets as he glanced at the documents on the table. My mother sat with her legs crossed, scrolling on her phone without looking up. Mark and Jenna stood near the window speaking quietly. Mr. Thompson entered with a folder tucked under his arm. He greeted each of us with a calm nod before taking his seat at the head of the table. He opened the folder, took out several pages, and began reading through the formal language that outlined assets, properties, and final instructions. The atmosphere in the room shifted when he mentioned the money my grandfather had entrusted to my father during his lifetime. My father straightened his posture, adjusting his tie with a measured movement. My mother set her phone aside and folded her hands. And now, Mr. Thompson continued, "We come to the distribution of the remainder of the estate." He paused to look around the room, then read aloud the portion of the will that named me as the sole beneficiary of everything my grandfather owned, from investments to properties to the balance of all accounts. The words echoed across the room, settling into the silence that followed. My father shot up from his chair, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. My mother gasped, reaching for the edge of the table, as if needing something steady to hold on to. "This doesn't make sense," my father said, his voice sharp. "There must be a mistake." Mr. Thompson shook his head slightly. "The will is clear. It was updated several months ago, with all requirements properly fulfilled." I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me. The room seemed too warm, the air thick. My father took a step closer to the table. "You expect me to believe he gave her everything?" He pointed at me as though I were responsible for the words on the page. She barely knew what he needed. She wasn't the one handling his care. I held his gaze and spoke quietly. "You told him to leave your house during a storm." My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I was there. My mother's face tightened. "Grace, this is not the time for accusations." Before anyone could say more, Mr. Thompson placed a small USB drive on the table. "Your grandfather left a recorded message to accompany the will," he said. "He asked that it be played only in the presence of all primary family members." He walked to the screen mounted on the wall and connected the device. The room dimmed as the video began. My grandfather appeared seated in a chair, the familiar lamp from my apartment behind him. His voice was steady, though his hands were folded tightly. He spoke about the decision he made with clarity, explaining how the $50 million given to my father had been intended to secure care and dignity during his final years. He spoke without bitterness, just truth. And then he explained why he chose to leave everything else to me. "You gave me a home when I had none," he said in the recording, "and you gave it without expectation." A quiet murmur moved through the room, but the video continued. "I want the rest of what I built to go towards something meaningful. Grace, use it well." When the screen went dark, no one spoke. My father's expression shifted from disbelief to anger. He leaned forward, gripping the back of the nearest chair. "I won't accept this," he said. "There has to be a way to contest it." Mr. Thompson kept his tone even. "The will is legally sound. Contesting it would not change the outcome." My father's jaw tightened as he tried to find the right response. My mother sat rigidly, her gaze fixed on the blank screen as if waiting for it to come back to life. My cousins looked from me to the table, trying to process what they had heard. I felt the weight of the room pressing in, but something steady rose within me, something that had taken shape in the ambulance in the hospital, in every late-night shift when I checked on him before sleeping on the floor. "My grandfather made his choice," I said quietly. "We should honor it." My father looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and simmering frustration. "You think you deserve this?" I didn't answer the question. Instead, I gathered the documents Mr. Thompson handed me, a sealed copy of the will, the video file, and several forms that required my signature. My fingers brushed the thick edge of the folder, and I felt a small tremor run through me, not from fear, but from the weight of everything shifting in that moment. The meeting ended in silence. My mother left quickly, clutching her purse. My father stayed behind a moment longer, staring at the chair where he had first stood in shock. Mark and Jenna offered brief goodbyes, unsure of how to react. I thanked Mr. Thompson and stepped out into the hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the quiet building. Outside, the air was crisp with the first hint of spring. I held the folder against my chest and walked slowly toward my car. The sky above was pale blue, and sunlight reflected off the windows of passing cars. I unlocked the door, settled into the driver's seat, and rested the documents on my lap. I knew the road ahead would not be simple. My parents' reaction was only the beginning, and the weight of what my grandfather had left me carried its own responsibilities. But as I sat there, letting the moment settle, I felt something steady forming a sense of purpose that had been growing long before any legal document confirmed it. I started the engine, the steady hum grounding me. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it. In the days following the will reading, I moved through my routines as though the ground had shifted beneath me. I kept the folder with my grandfather's documents on the small desk by my bedroom window, opening it each night to look over the pages again. The signatures, instructions, and account summaries felt both overwhelming and carefully placed, as if he had handed me a map he'd been drawing for years. I reread his note at the back, the one he'd written long before making the recording, and took in each line, slowly letting the quiet of the apartment settle around me. My parents called twice during that first week, but I let the phone ring each time. Their voices on the voicemail sounded sharp and rushed, asking for explanations I wasn't ready to give. I returned to work at the software company, walking through the familiar glass doors with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. My manager greeted me with a nod and asked about my grandfather, then gave me space to settle in. I sat at my desk with a cup of coffee and opened the file I'd been working on before everything had changed. The lines of code made sense to me in a way the rest of life didn't at that moment, and I focused on building out the features that had been waiting for my attention. When I looked up a few hours later, the office was quieter and sunlight stretched across the floor. I saved my work and closed the laptop, feeling a steady confidence in the decision I had made to return. Later that afternoon, I stopped by a nearby nursing home on my walk home. I had passed it countless times, but this was the first time I paused to look through the window. Several residents sat in the common room, some watching television, others staring quietly at the walls. A woman in a wheelchair held a book open on her lap, though she wasn't reading. A man sat beside the window, tapping his fingers lightly on the armrest as staff hurried past without stopping. The room felt dim despite the overhead lights, and I lingered for a moment before continuing down the sidewalk. The image stayed with me long after I reached my apartment. That evening I sat at my desk and opened my grandfather's folder again. I read through the section outlining charitable giving, one of the areas he had marked for future planning. He had handwritten a few notes about supporting elder care facilities, including a list of towns he had visited over the years. The handwriting slowly trailed off midway down the page. I ran my fingers lightly over the ink, thinking of the stories he had shared about wanting to make a difference in places where help was needed most. The idea he had planted during our evenings in the apartment began to take clearer shape. The next morning, I took a walk through a quiet part of town. A small commercial building sat near the edge of a park, the for lease sign faded but visible from the sidewalk. The brick exterior had peeling paint, and the windows were clouded with dust. Still, something about the building drew my attention. I approached the window and peered inside. Rows of old light fixtures hung from the ceiling, and a few pieces of furniture sat abandoned in a corner. It looked worn, but full of potential. I stood there for a long minute, imagining what it could become. I made a call to the number on the sign later that afternoon. The landlord, Mr. Jenkins, agreed to meet me the following day. He was a soft-spoken man in his 70s with graying hair and a careful way of moving. He walked me through the building, pointing out areas that needed repair and explaining the history of the space. I asked about zoning utilities and required permits, listening as he described each step in detail. When we reached the back hallway, I could already picture the rooms filled with comfortable chairs, warm lighting, and people who felt seen and cared for. I told him I was interested, and he handed me the paperwork to begin the process. Over the next few weeks, I balanced my work at the software company with meetings, consultations, and planning sessions. Architects visited the property to measure the rooms and discuss renovations. Contractors provided estimates and timelines, laying out materials across tables, while I reviewed each item carefully. I spoke with nurses, caregivers, and administrators from nearby facilities to understand the needs of the elderly in our community. Each conversation brought the vision into clearer focus, and I organized everything in a binder that soon filled with notes, sketches, and budget outlines. One evening I visited my grandfather's grave. The ground was still soft from recent rain, and the flowers from the service had begun to fade. I set a small bundle of daisies beside the stone and stood quietly. The breeze rustled the leaves overhead, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. I leaned down and placed my hand on the top edge of the stone. "I'm building something," I said softly, the words steady. "Something I think you would have wanted. Something good." As the project progressed, my parents reached out several more times. Their messages were a mix of questions, demands, and attempts at softened tones. I replied only when necessary, keeping the conversations short and focused. My father suggested meeting to discuss options, but I declined, simply saying that things were moving forward as planned. He sent a few more messages afterward, though each one grew shorter than the last. My mother called twice, leaving voicemails that shifted between concern and curiosity, but I didn't return them. When I finally signed the renovation contract, Mr. Jenkins shook my hand and smiled. "It'll be good to see life in this place again," he said. I watched as the crew began clearing out the old furniture and debris, their movements purposeful and efficient. The sound of hammers and saws echoed through the building, and for the first time it felt real. I stood in the doorway, imagining my grandfather walking through the halls, stopping to greet residents, and offering the same steady kindness he had shown throughout his life. During this time, I continued developing the healthcare software that had sparked my interest years earlier. I rented a small office near downtown and assembled a small team of developers and designers who shared my goal of building tools that supported patient safety and streamlined communication. We worked late into the evenings reviewing prototypes and refining features based on feedback from local hospitals. The project grew steadily, and I felt the same sense of purpose I had felt while caring for my grandfather during his months in the apartment. By early spring, renovations at the new center were well underway. Fresh paint covered the walls, new windows filled each room with light, and the garden outside began taking shape. I planted lavender daisies and a few rosebush flowers my grandfather had admired when he tended his small garden years ago. The walkway leading to the entrance was paved with smooth stones, and a wooden sign was installed near the door. It read, "Whitaker Home," carved in simple, elegant lettering. I traced the letters with my fingers before stepping inside. Inside the main hall, sunlight streamed through the newly cleaned windows, warming the polished floor. A few workers were assembling furniture in the common room, arranging chairs and tables to create a comfortable space. I walked slowly through the building, taking in each detail, the soft colors, the quiet corners, the rooms designed for rest and conversation. In that moment, I felt the presence of everything my grandfather had taught me, woven into each wall and walkway. As I stood at the center of the room, I took a deep breath and let the moment settle. The weight of the past months, the storm, the hospital, the will reading, had all led to this place. The building felt warm and full of promise, a reflection of the care my grandfather had shown throughout his life. There was still plenty of work ahead, both with the center and with my own company. But standing there with sunlight touching every corner of the room, I knew I had reached a turning point, one that would guide everything that came next. The weeks leading up to the opening of Whitaker Home passed with a steady rhythm of final inspections, licensing appointments, and meetings with the staff I had selected. Each day brought another delivery: new linens, kitchen equipment, therapy chairs, and I signed for each shipment before walking the hallways to see where everything was being placed. The scent of fresh paint still lingered in some rooms, mixing with the faint sweetness of the flowers planted outside. I arrived early each morning and stayed long after the sun slipped below the trees, adjusting details and checking on the progress of each space until everything matched the vision I had carried since the day I stood outside that dim nursing home window. During one of the final walkthroughs, I watched as the nurses arranged supplies on the shelves in the medication room. They moved with calm efficiency, speaking quietly to each other while they organized labels and checked expiration dates. A few rooms away, the kitchen staff was testing recipes for the first week of meals, the aroma of roasted vegetables and fresh bread drifting down the hall. I paused outside the main common room, where a handyman was tightening the last bolts on the bookshelves. He stepped aside so I could take a closer look. The shelves held a mix of novels, biographies, and large print books, many of which I had selected based on the stories my grandfather used to tell me. When opening day finally arrived, the early morning air held a light chill. I stood outside the entrance as the first residents approached, some walking with canes, others guided gently by their families. The staff welcomed each person with warm smiles, helping them inside and showing them to their rooms. I greeted families as they came through the door, answering questions and offering reassurance when needed. One woman thanked me for bringing something new to the community, her voice catching slightly as she spoke. I nodded and walked her to the garden entrance where a cluster of flowers was just beginning to bloom. Inside, the common room filled with quiet conversation. A few residents sat in the cushioned chairs near the fireplace, looking around as they adjusted to the new space. Others explored the hallways, pausing at framed photographs that showed scenes from nearby parks and landmarks. The air felt calm and welcoming, the kind of atmosphere I had hoped for when the idea first took shape in my grandfather's hospital room. As the morning went on, I moved from room to room, answering questions and making small adjustments to help residents feel at ease. Around midday, I stepped outside to catch my breath. The sun had climbed higher, warming the walkway and lighting the rows of flowers that lined the entrance. While I stood there, a young nurse named Emily approached me with a clipboard in hand. She mentioned a few requests from residents' extra pillows, a preference for certain mealtimes, and I wrote them down carefully before thanking her. As she walked back inside, I took a moment to steady myself. It was one thing to imagine a place like this. It was another to see it filled with people relying on the care we had promised to provide. In the days that followed, the routines at Whitaker Home settled quickly. Residents gathered in the common room mid-morning for coffee and conversation, and the sound of soft laughter often echoed down the hall. The young woman in the wheelchair began attending book discussions led by one of the nurses, and the man who once stared blankly out of a nursing home window now joined a small group that played cards in the afternoons. I moved through the building each day, checking on staff and speaking with residents, listening to their stories, and learning their preferences. Every corner of the home felt alive with the kind of warmth my grandfather had cherished. While the home took shape around me, the software company grew in its own steady way. I met with my team regularly, reviewing prototypes and adding features based on feedback from hospitals that had begun testing our tools. One afternoon, a doctor from a nearby facility visited our office to share results from their pilot program. He explained how the system helped reduce communication errors during shift changes, and he thanked us for the clarity and reliability it provided. I listened closely, making notes for the next development cycle. The work felt meaningful, not just in what it achieved, but in the way it connected to the conversations I had shared with my grandfather in that small apartment months before. As our projects expanded, I spoke with community leaders about partnerships that could support both the home and the software company. One local hospital offered to host training sessions for our system, while a nearby senior center expressed interest in collaborating on wellness programs. Each meeting carried a sense of progress, and I kept my grandfather's notes in the back of my mind as I considered each new opportunity. His handwriting, careful and deliberate, seemed to echo the steps I took. My parents called less often during this time. My father left a brief voicemail a few weeks after the opening, mentioning he had driven past the building and thought it looked fine. My mother sent a short text asking if I needed help with decorations, though she didn't specify what kind. I responded politely, but briefly, keeping the boundaries clear. They didn't press the matter, and the distance between us settled into a quiet, predictable pattern. One evening, after most of the residents had gone to bed and the staff had begun closing common areas, I walked through the garden outside. The lights along the path glowed softly, casting warm circles across the stones. I paused by a bench near the rose bushes and sat for a moment, breathing in the quiet scent of the flowers. The branches swayed gently in the breeze, rustling in a familiar way. I thought about my grandfather sitting beside me, leaning on his cane, while telling stories about the ranch. The memory felt close, like a gentle tap on the shoulder. As I walked back inside, I noticed one of the residents sitting near the front window, watching the headlights of passing cars. Her name was Margaret, and she had moved in just a few days earlier. I stopped to check on her, asking if she needed anything. She shook her head and smiled. "Sometimes I just like to watch the cars go by," she said. "It reminds me there's still a lot of life out there." I nodded, and we sat together quietly for a few minutes before she headed back to her room. On my way out that night, I passed the wooden sign at the entrance. The name carved there caught the glow of the porch light, casting a shadow on the ground. I placed my hand on the sign for a moment, then stepped back and locked the door behind me. The parking lot was empty except for my car, and the air felt cool and steady. As I started the engine, the headlights illuminated the path leading back to the main road. I knew the next steps would involve balancing the growing demands of the home and the company decisions that would shape the direction of both projects. And somewhere beyond that lay the question of how or if I would address the distance with my parents. But in that moment, with the road stretching ahead and the quiet hum of the engine beneath my hands, I felt a sense of calm. The work was far from finished, but something solid had taken root, something built from the promises I had kept, even when the path felt uncertain. And as the lights of Whitaker Home faded in the rearview mirror, I knew the coming days would bring new challenges along with choices that would guide everything that followed. The next few months settled into a gentle rhythm, the kind that creeps in quietly when the hardest parts of a journey have passed. I divided my days between Whitaker Home and the small office where my team worked on the software my grandfather had once encouraged me to build. Each evening when I pulled into the parking lot of the home, the lights glowing in the windows felt like a promise kept. Residents gathered in the common room for evening programs, their laughter drifting through the hallway as staff guided them to comfortable chairs or offered warm blankets. I often sat with them for a while, listening to stories from years long gone, grateful for the small moments that made the building feel alive. One Saturday morning, I arrived early and found an older couple sitting on the bench near the entrance. They were bundled in coats, holding hands as they waited. The woman stood when she saw me and introduced herself as the daughter of a new resident. She explained how relieved she felt knowing her father was finally in a place where he mattered. Her voice softened when she thanked me, and I felt the weight of her gratitude settle gently in my chest. Moments like that reminded me why this work had become so central to my life. Inside, residents participated in a gardening activity near the sunlit windows. Small pots filled the table, each holding young plants waiting to grow. I watched a man in his 70s lean over his pot pressing soil with steady hands as he talked quietly with the volunteer beside him. The scene reminded me of my grandfather tending his little garden when I was a child, coaxing flowers to bloom, even when the weather refused to cooperate. I stood there for a moment, allowing the memory to drift in and settle. At the software office later that week, we finalized a contract with a regional hospital system. Their administrators explained how our tools had improved patient transitions and reduced errors during overnight shifts. My team exchanged quiet smiles as they spoke each of us, understanding how far the project had come since it began with a handful of notes on my grandfather's kitchen table. When the meeting ended, I stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The sky was clear, and the afternoon light stretched across the parking lot, bringing a calm sense of direction to the day. Back at Whitaker Home, a routine formed where I visited each resident at least once a week. Margaret, the woman who enjoyed watching cars pass the window, invited me to join her for tea in the common room. She shared stories about her childhood on a small farm and the long road that brought her there. Each story opened a window into her past, and I found myself listening with the same quiet attention I once offered my grandfather. The home's halls echoed with the soft hum of conversation, and I felt steady walking through them, as if the building itself held a rhythm that guided each step. My parents remained distant. My father sent a brief message congratulating me on the home's opening after he saw something about it online. My mother reached out once asking if she could stop by, though she didn't follow up when I gently suggested another time would be better. The distance between us wasn't sharp or painful anymore. It simply existed like a doorway left open without anyone choosing to walk through. I didn't push, and neither did they. What mattered now was the life unfolding in front of me, a life shaped by the choices my grandfather made and the ones I had made in return. One late afternoon, I walked through the garden behind the home. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the path. I paused near the roses, watching the petals move with the breeze. I thought of him, then his quiet strength, his patient way of listening, and the evenings we shared in my apartment when neither of us knew what the next day would bring. The memory brought a calm warmth, and I realized that his presence had never really faded. It lived in these moments and the people we cared for and the safety this place offered. As I stood there, I understood something simple and steady: justice had come, not through anger or revenge, but through the dignity he had regained in his final months and the home built in his honor. What he entrusted to me had grown into something larger than either of us could have pictured, a place where no one would ever feel cast aside, a place rooted in the kindness he showed me long before money complicated anything. When I locked the doors that evening, the soft glow of the hallway lights reflected off the polished floors, carrying a quiet sense of peace. I stepped outside and took a slow breath, letting the night air settle around me. The work was ongoing, and there would always be more to do, but for the first time in a long while, the path ahead felt clear. If this story reminds you of someone you've loved, someone you've cared for, or someone who taught you a lesson you still carry, I'd love to hear it. And if you'd like to be here for the next story, feel free to follow along.